Thanks, everyone, for coming today in person. It's been kind of, as we all have been through, I think a lot of us who work at historic sites and institutions, balancing the in-person versus virtual has been quite an experience. But we are glad to be in person, and I should also mention that the talk will be recorded and will be, once Cindy works her magic, it'll be online. I'm Greg Kimball, and I'm the Director of Public Services and Outreach here at the Library of Virginia, and delighted to introduce a good friend and scholar today. A few housekeeping things. We do have comment cards, and we do really appreciate feedback on our talks and programs. So please fill that out if you can before you leave. We do have an ongoing course programs of all kinds of different ones. We have our transcribe project where you get to transcribe all these old documents so that regular people can read them. We have some lunchtime talks. We have a whole variety of different programming that we do, so do check our website and make sure that you're up to date on what the Library of Virginia is offering. So today we are going to be talking about midwifery with Deanne Graham. It's always interesting how people come to different kinds of their careers, and particularly studying history. I know for me, my experience in Germany, in the Army, before I ever even thought about going to college, was really important to me because it kind of turned me on to the fact that the past actually was kind of interesting and worth studying. Deanne comes from a position of someone who was doing policy work and work within this community before she took on and started to think about going back to get her history degree, which she did at VCU. So I think that always adds an interesting perspective. Someone has looked at this from a modern perspective and then goes back and tries to find the roots of how we came to be where we are. She also has a master's from Sarah Lawrence. So she's here as a Virginia Humanities Fellow, and I also want to give a shout out to Virginia Humanities for sponsoring these fellowships. We've had just a tremendous group this fall who've done really fine research and work in our collections and in other collections, and it's just been a fantastic relationship with them. So thanks to Virginia Humanities for helping to sponsor all of our fellows. We'll have one more, I believe, in the summer this year, in 2022. So without further ado, Deanne Graham.
Thank you, and I want to thank the Virginia Humanities also, and the Library of Virginia, and the staff that has helped, John and Mary and Brent and Greg. I have not presented in between living in China and the pandemic, I have not presented in like 4 years, and I'm feeling very rusty. But also, this is, what is lost with the medicalization of birth is that it is an expression of women's sexuality. And with that comes a lot of, in our society, a lot of shame and trauma, causes within the birthing community a lot of anger and contention. And I hope that I'm going to be opening up so that we can have a conversation. And I do really want to thank Greg. If you've ever been with a woman in labor, and by the way, I can get very emotional. I just got to attend a beautiful birth on Christmas Day in Caroline County, and that magic is still with me. But when a woman gets near her time, often she'll go, I can't do this. And you know, we're there. And Greg heard me these last few days going, I can't do this. And he goes, no, we're almost there. So I want to thank you again. The term ancient is often used, and maybe overused, some think, in discussions on the history of midwives. And although it seems cliche, what else would you say to describe women's oldest profession? Because I think we can safely assume that women were helping other women give birth before we began using our bodies for survival. In the book of Exodus, the Pharaoh called upon the Hebrew midwives to serve him by killing the newborn Hebrew boys. The midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, claimed the Hebrew women were fit and gave birth before they could arrive. Every society and culture has a community selected woman to serve and assist women in their labors to bring forth new community members. The grab in the lower belly and pressure surging in the low back signaled it was time to call the midwife. The community-based traditional midwife was and is an empiricist, having seen birth from start to finish many times. From the numerous observations, she knew the common patterns and the variations of pregnancy, labor, and birth, probability patterns. With these repeated observations over several generations, taught from one woman to the next, general assumptions could be safely made as to how things would go, why they were going this way, and what skills would bring about the desired outcome. As part of the community, and this is so important, she knew the laboring woman before her, and her skills were applied within the cultural context of the community and the family. So what is a midwife? Today, with 3 different credentials, different educational paths, and as many practice styles, that is not an easy and sometimes contentious question to answer. What would be agreed upon is that the historical midwife was a woman whom the community chose to attend them at their time, and she learned her craft from either her mother or another older woman in the community. Acquiring skills through apprenticeship may have been the norm in the old country, but in the first successful British colony settled by a corporation, being selected to be the community midwife could be because you had had children or because you were the only woman there. Goochland native Sarah Barnett testified as a deponent in a 1800 court case that when she was called in 1791 to a birth, she had not yet had the calling of a midwife. But when she was returned to the birth in 1794, she had the calling of the midwife. Being the mother of 11 children was adequate experience for the woman to consult with Barnett. It is difficult to know what path historical midwives trod. Historical research requires documentation. Birth was in the woman's sphere, with perhaps an inscription made in the family Bible. Although the mother may have been grateful for her midwife's presence, unless there was a problem, that engagement was otherwise not a recordable event. In the past, most women lived in the margins of men, their lives recorded only in the reference to whom they were married to, if that person was important, or if they got in trouble. Fellow Texan Brent Tarter, the LVA, the library's Virginia colonial history expert, told me he was not taught at UVA graduate school that women were in Jamestown. Although I've known Brent for 12 years, we both moved to Virginia in 1971, he to Charlottesville and me to Richmond. Considering that Virginia just admitted undergraduate women the year before, perhaps we should not be surprised that it was not taught women were in Jamestown. Even when the admission is pointed out, as in a 1992 article I just found, documentation is available on Jamestown women, and yet they are still ignored. I recently found a capstone article from Vassar written in 2019 where they mention that Africans arrived in 1619, although they don't say Virginia, and then they just skip over Virginia and say that the first European midwives were on the Mayflower. Feminist history is little better. Childbirth was not a subject of feminist scholars. It was not until the late 1970s that books were published mentioning childbirth and midwives. The Diary of Martha Ballard was deemed unimportant by several feminist scholars before Laurel Thatcher held space and revealed the riches found in Ballard's life. Seldom have individual midwives been mentioned or even known. Finding the names of Virginia midwives in their communities has been my project for 13 years. So what I'm about to say is controversial in the midwifery community. The first non-indigenous midwives in North America were English. With the stricture of documentation, I will discuss the midwives in order of appearance, the English and then the African. From Jamestown to the antebellum, I'll then focus on the period when Virginia midwives had the greatest autonomy, and therefore, too, the women they served, from roughly the 1850s to the turn of the century. Although we know nothing of their ways, once again, no documentation, I want to acknowledge the primacy and skill of Native women as the first Virginia midwives. The writings of Englishmen claim that the Native American women did not experience the difficulties of labor as English women did. This was attributed to Powhatan women's natural lives, unhampered by civilization. In the same breath, the European men wrote of the need of the women to be freed of their savage ways in order to improve the quality of their lives. I submit, without the curse of Augustine's original sin hanging over their heads, birth came without shame and blame. It is now well known that a mother's belief system affects her childbearing year, as does the practitioner she chooses. The experience of the woman who sat with Anne Burris laden when she gave birth to her daughter Virginia in December of 1609 is unknown. At age 14, she arrived at Jamestown as the maid of Mistress Forrest. She married John Laden, a man 10 years her senior, 3 months later, and the next summer was pregnant with her first child. Anne and her husband moved to Point Comfort, where they escaped the starving times. That summer, the Falcon arrived with as many as perhaps 20 women. The Ladens eventually had 4 daughters, all before 1622. Those who escaped the starving times, which is another item of Virginia history that is often left out, we tend to prefer drama in our origin stories. But among the terrible losses of the winter of 1609 and 10, the starving time in Jamestown, was a pregnant woman whose husband murdered her and, quote, ripped the child from her womb and threw it in the river, and after chopped the mother in pieces and salted her for food, unquote. Take that in for a minute. Every time I read that. And while we do not know if the Virginia Company had the wherewithal to send a midwife, women were giving birth in Jamestown. A popular narrative in the birth and midwifery community is that women midwives were often accused of witchcraft. The first documentation of a Virginia midwife is a witch trial. Goody Wright was sued in September of 1626. Giles Allington had asked her to attend his wife in her confinement, and when his wife found out she was left-handed, she didn't want her at her birth. Goody Wright found out and showed up more than a little bit angry. After that, everything that went wrong in the Allington house was blamed on Goody Wright. Mrs. Allington got a breast infection. The baby eventually died. And Lieutenant Allington also became sick. Wright was known for being outspoken. She told a young woman who caught her ire that she'd make her dance stark naked. People asked Wright her opinion on when certain people would die, and she obliged them. One man testified he had left 2 hens with Wright to keep until another woman could take them. Later, Wright then said to someone else the hens would never make it as the recipient would be dead soon. Perhaps the woman to receive the hens was sickly, and it was no great jump, although perhaps less than kind, to comment on her imminent demise. Living in a land that was harsh and unforgiving to English ways, everyone, but especially the women called upon to minister to the sick and wipe the brow of the laboring woman, would have been seen more and been closer to the realities of life and death. That which may have made her an excellent midwife, keen powers of observation and experience, were turned and used against her. And we had another celebrated witch trial here in Virginia, that of Grace Sherwood of Princess Anne County. Protected while her husband was alive when she was first accused of being a witch in 1697, she found herself tried for witchcraft and tested by dunking in the Lynnhaven River, now known as Witch Duck. In court and church records, we find evidence of colonial midwives, documenting both the mundane and dramatic events of the community, while diaries and journals also recorded the pivotal roles of midwives in broader community affairs. Widow Hollins sued Agnes Williams for attending her birth. Unhappy with her payment of 12 chickens, midwife Hollins sued for 18. Diaries and journals also. In 1652, John Thurston wrote of his newborn daughter, quote, who was baptized the next day and named Rachel by Mr. Joseph Brent minister, Mrs. Haywood midwife, being my 20th child. There is a strong belief in midwifery's community today that at one time women had total control and agency over their bodies without interference from the church or the government or medical men. The idea that birth process itself was totally within the sphere of women was technically correct. But records show that, in fact, midwives were instruments of the state in bastardy and fornication cases, showing the hierarchy of English law and male patriarchy was always in force and at play. With access to women at their most vulnerable moments and knowledge of the birth process made them privy to the secret and intimate stories of their clients. Midwives were charged by authorities to police the morality of the community by uncovering bastard fathers, by determining the gestational age of the child of the recently married. Such rulings could condemn or exonerate a young couple from sin. No less important, in the court cases of fornication, extracting the name of the father kept the parish from having to support the child. In a 1664 case that presaged a profound change in Virginia law, the Northampton ecclesiastical authorities put midwife Eleanor Gething in charge of indentured servant Anne Orthwood. Orthwood was 24 and had arrived from England the year before looking for a better life. Unmarried, pregnant, and unwilling to reveal the father of her child, she challenged the social fabric of the community that sought to control fornication and identify errant fathers. And as I said before, just as important, the parish did not want to have to pay for these children. They wanted the father to. They wanted the name of the father so they could charge him. Anne was not forthcoming with the father's name, so they put her in the midwife's house a month before her confinement to see if Gething could get the name of the father. And she was not forthcoming. It was believed at that time that during the height of labor and the pain, that a mother would reveal the name of the father, and that with that pain you would not lie. And that is what Gething did. Gething would extract a confession during childbirth. Anne Orthwood birthed twins, one of whom died, as did she. And it was rumored in the days after that Gething withheld support from Orthwood until she revealed the name of the father, one John Kendall, thus precipitating Orthwood's death. Two other midwives who had attended the birth testified in Gething's defense. The case influenced Virginia law with the status of the child following the mother rather than the father. Not surprisingly, this occurred at the same moment that enslaved Africans were becoming the primary workforce in the colony. The law ensured that children born of illicit liaisons between white men and black women would suffer lifetime servitude. Women were always subject to male legal power, and white colonial Virginia midwives stood in the intersection of public and private worlds and struggled with divided allegiances between the birthing women and community moral authorities. The midwife's role as moral and legal arbiter, as well as the perception of power and mystery that midwives commanded from their knowledge of birth and healing, could spark resentments. Midwives walked a fine line between saint and Satan. The English colonial midwife reflected the community that she served and tended to be of a middling class and were often literate at the time. Midwifery was often a widow's occupation. Williamsburg's Catherine Katie Blakely was widowed in 1736 at the age of 41, and she acquired great wealth from her husband and chose to never remarry. Blakely held business accounts around Williamsburg and Yorktown, took in boarders, and caught the babies of both white and black, free and enslaved. When her obituary appeared in the Virginia Gazette in October of 1771, it was an anomaly for a woman's obituary to be in a paper. And it read, Mrs. Catherine Blakely of this city in the 76th year of her age, an eminent midwife, and who, in the course of her practice, brought upwards 3,000 children into the world. At that time, the population of Williamsburg was 2,000 people. And a month after she died, an article in the Virginia Gazette showed a new shift in midwifery. It's believed that Mary Rose was the wife of a William and Mary professor, and here she is touting to have scientific knowledge and under the approbation of Doctors Pasteur and Gale. And it is this time you see the rise of the man midwife. Dr. Galt's advertisement in the Virginia Gazette. Despite what most people believe, childbirth has historically been very successful, with 94% of births being spontaneous and vertex, head down, the way you want it. Another 4% required some help, and another 2% needed a lot of help. In the 17th and 18th century, death from childbirth was low in context to the other things that childbearing mothers would die from. In general, the English New World, women did better than those in England, those in the north of British North America did better than those in the south because of malaria. High mortality was in fact an artifact of several causes such as industrialization and the entrance of the meddlesome midwife, which was a phrase coined to describe the male practitioner attending normal births. Childbed fever was almost unknown before doctors began attending normal birth. In the English class system, physicians were of an upper class standing and practiced by providing instruction and prescription, but never touching the body. Touching and procedures were left to the trades of barber surgeons and apothecaries. While British physicians looked down on surgeons and apothecaries, American physicians were less inclined to resist the label because they jostled in a crowded field in need of general practitioners. In the mother country, practicing man midwifery gave the surgeon apothecary entree as the family doctor, thus providing for clientele and elevating their status. The American physician also had a persistent need to elevate their status despite their claims of scientific knowledge. The early Republic physician in general, and the antebellum Southern physician in particular, began to attend the births of upper-class women as backup to the still trusted midwife, just in case complications arose. They would eventually be able to convince these women to just hire them, and you won't need the midwife. Birth was, for the most part, straightforward. It was easy money, and physicians got their foot in the family door. With the exception of being called to attend valuable enslaved women in the antebellum period, these men rarely attended the births of the lower classes. Virginian John Minson Galt, wishing to distinguish himself from other practitioners in Virginia, traveled to England to further his medical training. Galt purchased training from the eminent British obstetrician William Smellie, and upon his return to Williamsburg, advertised his services. Now I'm going to talk about African-American midwives and the status of the 20 and odd West Africans who landed at Point Comfort in 1619 on the White Lion is beyond the scope of this talk. The first documented African woman giving birth in Virginia was named Isabella, and she was on the boat, the ship. As with most women in the past, it's not known who was with her at her time, if they were white women, the other African women, or both. Both she and her husband, Anthony, were treated as indentured servants. Their child was born in 1624 and named William in honor of a Virginia planter. With their profit line in mind, enslavers captured teenagers and sometimes those in their early 20s who were strong with a lifetime of work ahead of them. Because midwifery has historically been an older woman's profession, it would have been a miracle that one of the young women on the White Lion was a midwife. What they no doubt did bring with them was their culture and what they had been taught about being a woman and giving birth. The first African women would have taken all of that and forged a new midwifery in this new land they were forced to enter. Like the Powhatan women, they did not see birth travail as punishment, although with enslavement, that would come from both religion and enslavers. 18th century references mention midwives characterized as free mulattoes who served at Carter's Grove. Mary Roberts, practiced in the 1740s. Betty Armfield, who was described in the 1800 Free Black Registry of York County, is 5 foot 6 inches high, age 66, with a bright mulatto long gray hair. She practiced from 1782 until around 1813. Other early enslaved midwives, those women were free, was Granny Venus, and Charles Friend wrote in his farm journal that Aggie helped the older midwife until she became the farm midwife. Most of what we know about enslaved midwives comes from the antebellum period. Ironically, many of these midwives enjoyed relative autonomy in plying their craft in the patronage of even elite whites. Paradoxically, the history of black birth in this period also featured experimentation on black bodies by white physicians. Other enslaved midwives labored to protect their enslaved mothers from doctors who sold care plans to slave owners feeling pinched by the end of the transatlantic slave trade, guaranteeing fecundity of the enslaved women, something they didn't have the skills to provide. Enslaved midwife Margaret Graves was born on the property of the Tinsley family of Tatomi Plantation in Hanover County, and she was hired out by other slave owners. One particular birth that Graves attended revealed the remarkable trust that white women placed in black midwives' skills. She was called out to a complicated birth of Judge Leake's wife. There were 2 doctors from Richmond there, and they were less than kind and told her to get herself out of there. And as you can see, the lady of the house sent the doctors away and kept Mildred. Such trust even extended to many established physicians. Claire Robinson was a 60-year-old free woman of color in Richmond, and she petitioned the General Assembly in 1848 to allow her to stay in Virginia after her emancipation. She argued she was of an advanced age and bound to the city by the strongest of all ties, her children being slaves living in the city. And she held associations of the kindliest character with many families of white citizens resident. Robertson supported her petition by noting that, quote, she had several years professionally employed as an accoucheur or midwife and given satisfaction generally in that capacity, and evidence wherefore she tenders the certificate of the Honorable James A. Seaton, drawn up by his own hand and signed by a large number of medical faculty in Richmond who in the course of their obstetrical practice had occasion to employ her and kindly give this testimony of their valuation, unquote. Thus, the strange irony. Such women had community standing to practice their art and craft, but they were still subject to the law and consequences of the slave system. Is this ability part of the slave system? That masters collectively control who does what, and the state is relatively weak, i.e., the state didn't mess with the rights of the enslavers? After the war and emancipation, such women continued to practice largely unimpeded. Here's an example of Harriet Randolph, born around 1820 to 30, and she practiced until her death in 1911. And in her obituary, said she served leading families and physicians, mostly a word-of-mouth practice. So it's obvious she was serving both black and white women. This is Margaret Jones of Lynchburg, and she was a pillar of wisdom in her community. Midwives, white and black, continued to enjoy community approbation and support. Advertisements for midwives appeared in newspapers And midwives frequently mention their association with the quote-unquote better physicians of the city. Agitation for licensure and state control cropped up, but the reaction to it suggests the level of comfort the general public and many physicians had with a traditional midwife. In this article from 1871, a doctor complained to in the Richmond Dispatch that some were lobbying the legislature to establish a board of examiners for midwives. He noted with feigned astonishment and no little sarcasm that, quote, "Hitherto so many thousands of valuable lives, Virginia's greatest and best, have been imperiled at the very threshold of their existence because our mothers and grandmothers would trust themselves to uneducated old women in accouchement," unquote. Again, quote, "But this thing must be stopped," he mockingly continued, "and no one but an educated accoucheur with a $40 fee be allowed to minister to the suffering patient," unquote. He pointed out that many of the problems of such an arrangement, including the burden on the poor who could not afford a physician. This physician's skepticism of licensure no doubt derived from his own knowledge of the relative skills of midwives and physicians in the birthing room. 4 years later, in 1875, a case that starkly revealed the limits of scientific treatment roiled the Richmond medical community. A physician treated with morphine the 7 months pregnant wife of shoe magnate Stephen Putney. She had had sudden abdominal pain, headache, and nausea. When the morphine wore off, she was no better, and they could not find the original doctor. They found another doctor who came in, and Mrs. Putney died in convulsion a few moments after he arrived. He blamed the first doctor, and at the next Richmond Academy of Medicine meeting, there were arguments, and sides were taken, and there was fisticuffs, and a penknife was thrown, but it didn't hit the other doctor. It hit another bystander in the wrist, who later said, "I was just there for the scientific papers." The next morning, 4 of the doctors, and I believe one of them may have been Stuart McGuire, I can't find that research, found themselves in police court with $2,500 bonds and told to behave in the future. This is reminiscent of the antebellum period, when the 2 groups of men most likely to duel were the newspaper editors and the doctors. What of the white midwives, the spiritual descendants of Catherine Blakely? It is usually supposed that black women dominated the ranks of traditional midwifery after the Civil War, but white women continued to practice well after the antebellum period. These women built on the legacy of such women like Nancy Elliott, the wife of a War of 1812 veteran who practiced in Pittsylvania County. There were important differences, though. The traditional white midwife remained a trusted community member mostly in certain rural areas, especially in the mountains and the valleys of Western Virginia. Orlean Hawks Puckett is perhaps the best known of these women. She served 1,000 mothers without a loss, and her cabin is still on the Blue Ridge Parkway, and her story has been told in a biography. The other remaining bastion of white midwifery was in the urban centers, especially in Richmond and Norfolk. White women like Fanny Stewart can be found in the city directories well into the 19th century. Yet others took out advertisements in the newspaper. These ads tell us interesting things. First, these women have the resources to advertise and typically had full-blown practices. For example, Isabella Vos used the terminology of physician, calling herself a doctress. And she also ran a clinic hospital with her physician husband. By perusing the ads, we also see a preponderance of ethnic European names, Lafon, Dressel, etc. Interestingly, Isabella Vos's maiden name was actually Distradoza, and she had been born in Madrid, Spain. We will return to her story in a few minutes. Many of these women came from cultures where midwifery still existed side by side with formal medicine, just as it did in Virginia until the 20th century. But trouble was brewing. In 1905, physician Susan Abigail Roop sued the J.D. Hill Printing Company for listing her as a midwife in the Richmond City Directory. She asserted that the entry damaged her reputation because the term midwife was construed by the public generally as conveying an idea not altogether complimentary. The Law and Equity Court dismissed her claim. Roop was a native of Massachusetts and had only recently received her medical degree. While in her mid-40s, she attended a Maryland institution because no Virginia schools were open to her. Perhaps her northern background, where the progressive movement launched earlier, and her active participation in the club women movement and association with midwifery, being primarily black women, affected her decision to sue. And this is her home in Highland Springs, which still stands. That same year, another court case reflected the increased stricter and surveillance of midwifery even before state licensing. A black midwife and healer named Minnie Vann stood before the Richmond Mayor's Court accused of practicing medicine without a license. The newspaper cryptically noted that the case aroused interest, and she was bailed out at a cost of $100, a significant fee. No doubt public sentiment and acceptant practice of hiring black midwives caused considerable public comment regarding the case. The same public ambivalence colored the court case of Isabella Vos. Isabella Pearl Distradoza had been born in Madrid, Spain, and migrated to America with her husband, German physician William Vos. When Vos's husband died in 1885, Isabella carried on her practice. In 1903, a strange series of events brought her before the Richmond Police Court. A young man from a respectable family brought an infant to be placed with a family. Vos tried to find a home for the illegitimate child, but after failing to do so, returned it to the young man. The child was eventually found abandoned in an alley, and both Vos and the young man were charged with attempted murder. Despondent over her arrest, Vos took her own life by poison. Hollywood Cemetery. Perhaps the most notable element for our purposes is the newspaper coverage of these tragic events. The reporters were generally sympathetic to Vos's plight and noted her standing in the community. Family members reported that Vos especially agonized over the loss of her reputation. Ominously, her prosecution was part of a larger uptick of cases brought against midwives, white and black, in the early 20th century. This was part and parcel of a larger movement by progressives and doctors to solve the so-called midwife problem. Women and midwives generally enjoyed autonomy in the late 19th century. No one was investigating their sexual activities, and they could still choose their practitioner. Doctors were still fighting for their professional and economic lives, something they would do until after World War II, and sought government protection. Licensing appeared to be on the local level until the state, Virginia, instituted licensing in 1912. Obstetricians were not heralded as new men of science by other physicians who had some new discoveries that set them apart from folk ways. If a woman who, in their eyes, was an illiterate immigrant or black could help a woman in her birthing, then it was not medicine. In an article in the 1919 Richmond Times-Dispatch typified this disdain of folk medicine. Under the blazing headlight, many American women needlessly sacrificed. The article derided the quote-unquote Negro mammy and self-taught midwife, who still held sway in many communities. The article presaged the 1921 Shepherd-Towner Act that would further reduce the agency of local women and healers. Doctors and bureaucrats increasingly blamed deaths during birth and campaigned for the elimination of folk midwifery altogether. So it's the midwife's fault. No matter what, it's the midwife's fault. And this did not square well with public health studies, even at the time. This was in the same newspaper page as this. The practice of medicine was also changing. The clinician and country doctor gave way to the science-based approach that diverted the gaze away from the patient and towards technology and process. Harriet Randolph and Isabella Vos, for all their differences, both employed a woman-centered, holistic approach. In contrast, medical students were taught didactically about birth, but would not have seen a woman give birth until they graduated and were practicing. They got on-the-job training. MCV student C.D. Bennett would not have practiced what was described in his 1904 notebook on how to get a pregnant woman in a Walters position to open the pelvis. He wrote, "Always chloroform patient before moving to the edge of the bed. Don't frighten the women by moving her about and showing her instruments to frighten her." It was deemed inappropriate for students to learn on affluent women. Eyes were turned towards the clients of midwives, working class and ethnic women, for learning material. And so was born the university system of offering low-cost birth to these women in exchange for students learning on their bodies. A national plan to eliminate midwives was launched that was based on defamation of the now lower-class midwives and changing women's perception of the physiological normality of birth to the belief in pregnancy and birth as pathology. Dr. Whitridge Williams of Johns Hopkins and the author of the famous Williams Obstetrics textbook was able to say in the mid-19-teens, quote, "No longer can it be said that the physician is like a terrier sitting at the hole waiting for the rat to escape," unquote. Allopathic practitioners, the forerunner of today's doctors, organized as the American Medical Association in 1847 in an attempt to monopolize the market. Interestingly, these physicians were more likely to cause harm and death with their bloodletting and purging with mercury-based concoctions. In 1910, with Rockefeller funding of the Flexner Report, that monopoly was finally finally realized. Allopathic medicine embraced the German medical model based on the paternalism of the servant-master relationship. Affluent women began seeking to escape, or I should say continued to seek to escape Eve's curse, and they unwittingly gave up their agency for the promises of pain relief. Wanting to be seen as scientific and modern, heavily medicalized childbirth with complications became a hallmark of the upper-class woman, and in the ensuing years, the other classes followed. Virginia was also deeply implicated in another dark chapter of the early 20th century progressive movement that affected midwives. Although beyond the scope of this presentation, the campaign of Walter Plecker to promote and implement the state's racial integrity law must be noted. Just as midwives in the colonial period became agents of the state in rooting out bastardy, Plecker forced midwives to classify births as white or colored, thus erasing other identities, especially those of indigenous people. It should also come as no surprise that this assertion of racist control occurred as midwifery became a majority black profession. And this is an article from 1954 where this midwife was retiring, and the community still celebrated her, but she would have been the last of a kind for sure. So, I'm going to tell you about me, see if I can keep it together. My stepfather was a doctor. His father was a doctor. I grew up with AMA-style, Chicago-style medicine, with my grandfather railing at the dinner table because Reader's Digest had printed another article about people's health, and they should only get that information from their doctors. So when I got pregnant with my first child, I went to the obstetrician. My childbirth classes were not part of the hospital, Maui Memorial, and there were some hippie types in my mind who were using midwives, and I thought they were crazy. I went on to have a very traumatic birth that ended up with postpartum depression. I remember every time I would try to get upright, somebody would come in and push me down. My second birth here in Richmond was a little bit better, but I was still told what to do, was not asked for consent, and I again experienced postpartum depression. I was also told that there were things wrong with my body, that I would always have trouble giving birth. I had one last child in the hospital, and by that time I had read my obstetrician, the Riot Act, and they listened to me. But being in their culture and in their house, I still found myself doing things that I said I would not do. So I knew that I could never have complete autonomy in the medical setting. For my fourth child, I hired an illegal midwife who never told me what to do and listened to me. And when my time came, she didn't do anything to me. She held space while I did the process of boarding my son on that sweet Christmas day 30 years ago. I went on to have one more child at home and named her after my midwife. In the mid-90s, I started activism of lobbying to decriminalize Virginia home birth midwives. They were starting to arrest midwives in Virginia. They were okay as long as the home birth midwives stayed in the mountains. But you were getting professors from William and Mary, wives of anesthesiologists that placed epidurals all day, wanting home births with illegal practitioners. So that's how I got involved. And to try to stop us, my midwife was arrested and put up on charges for a crime that was not committed. Eventually, and this picture is from the day we did a plea bargain, which fell on May 5th of 2000, which happens to be International Midwives Day. Home birth midwives were legalized in Virginia in 2005, and I'd like to tell you that everything is great now, but it's not. As we have seen in other states, the medical community continues to harass both the now legal midwives and their clients, especially if a transfer happens. They are constantly trying to limit the practice and therefore access and autonomy of Virginia women. And today's midwives are losing skills. That which made them incredible in the past. Martha Ballard, the Maine midwife, that you can get the book that Laurel Thatcher wrote, when she wrote that a baby was breech or that there were twins, she didn't go, oh my God, it was a breech. She just said, breech birth, as if it were nothing. And those are skills that traditional midwives have. They were skills that my midwife had. She has presided over, I don't know, 500 breeches, 300 twins, some triplets. And today's midwives are not learning those skills, or they are made afraid to use them. So this story is not over. And we are still seeking for a time when women have complete autonomy over their bodies. Thank you.
Yes?
Thank you for that presentation. Can you repeat again? You said there was a time where you said that midwives had like the most autonomy. What was that period?
The postbellum. So it would have been like Reconstruction into the turn of the century. And I'm just guessing that enough other things were going on that they left women alone. I mean, obviously, there were still issues, but not here.
Other questions? Yes.
I've got two questions, Stephen. One, how are contemporary midwives learning? Is it still the same sort of traditional methods of family and elders, or are there more formal structures?
For home birth midwives, you can do what's called the PEP process, which is a portfolio, and that is going to be more apprenticeship model for the whole thing. Then they have what are called, MEAC, M-E-A-C, and I forget what that stands for. That is more formal, and there are schools, proprietary schools. Both avenues have to do apprenticeship time clinicals with a preceptor. So yeah, there is a push to get rid of the PEP process. And I can tell you from my research and also the midwives I know, it is a far superior process over the classroom approach. You know, sort of, not that the classroom people don't eventually, you know, they have to see and do so many births and clinicals start to, but it's hands-on from the beginning with the PEP process.
And secondly, looking at the 18th and 19th centuries when enslaved and black midwives were working in Virginia or elsewhere, I can only imagine, what if a white woman who was the client in that situation, she died, or a child died, there was a complication, it may not have been anyone's fault. Would that black midwife in that situation just be like a weaponized situation to blame her?
That is always a possibility. I've not come across that yet. And like with everything, it goes back to relationship.
That power dynamic is inherent.
Yeah, it is. And yet, many of these black midwives in the antebellum were valued. And also, they were more, I hate using this word, but more accepting of death than we are now. We think, we're going to live forever. And, if we just got to the right doctor, took the right pill, did this, did that, and death was all around you at that time.
The only cases I've seen, and again, by no means do I know the comprehensive story here, but it's a great question. But the infanticide cases I've seen are living children, well post birth. But that did happen. One of our archivists right now is working on a case during the Civil War where a very young black woman was accused of killing a child, even though 2 previous children had died from seizures. And even some white physicians came forward and said, basically, this is wrong, and one of them wrote to the governor. Unfortunately, she was still executed.
What time period is that you're speaking of?
I'm sorry?
What time period?
That was, I believe, 1863. It's really a fascinating case. And there were some, one of the things that, Deanne, you might speak to some of the other infanticide cases we saw pop up occasionally in that late 19th century period.
Yeah, the newspapers are something else. Talk about social media. All kinds of, and talk about rabbit holes, because you find what you're there for, and then you go, oh. And I was surprised. There were many child abandonment articles and infanticide articles. And there was one in Henrico County in the late, I think the early 1900s, where a midwife was charged with 4 other women in an infanticide case. And I have not run that down to the end. I just found it last week, so I can't tell you how that one. But there was an article where the infant was left behind in the hotel room. Or the parents ran to get on the boat and left the toddler behind. So I want to do deeper dive in all of those as to, is this something new, or is it just the papers are now reporting on it?
Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Oh, did you have
I
another?
have one more.
Sure, go ahead. That's fine.
Would nursemaids inherently or commonly have midwifery skill sets, or are those very separate sort of lines of work?
There's no hard lines of delineation of, with domestic medicine, which is the historical norm. Skills were had by many people. What do you mean by nursemaids?
I work at the Marshall House right across the street,
Okay.
and we're aware of an enslaved nursemaid who labored in the home. And I know she cared for various Marshall generations of children. I wondered whether it was likely to have been present at birth.
Oh, I would definitely say yes. And something that we've talked about, you've got black and white bodies really in close contact with each other. And you know what's going on. It's not like...
It's the irony of the antebellum period, right? That it's not a model of racism based on segregation. In fact, it's very intimate in many ways, in kind of a very perverse way. So, yeah.
And what I would add to that, and this is an argument that gets me in trouble, is this idea that even with today's professional midwife, that they are saving women when birth works really well. And it is a woman who is giving birth, and we rarely need to intervene. So yes, as I hopefully said, we'll stumble a bit here and there. Many times the midwife was just someone who had had children or was present. And if you think about it, she's just there. It's the woman who is laboring that has the skills and will be doing the work.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Great. Catherine?
Yeah, just one more thing. So Deanne, have you looked at, you had talked about, in the early period, despite kind of what I think popular opinion would be, a lot of women died in childbirth, as opposed to other causes back in the colonial period. Have you looked at kind of the modern day issues with so much intervention with childbirth and kind of the mortality rates of either mother and or children?
Yeah.
How does that compare?
Well, I'll tell you, in the 1920s, 250,000 American women died in childbirth. And the rich were dying at a faster clip than the working class. And it's because they used physicians. And a British practitioner at that time said that the American practitioner engages in an orgy of interventions. And that was the cause of the high mortality rate. Now what changed was with World War II, we got antibiotics and blood transfusions, which put out the obstetrical fires. But here we are now with the highest maternal mortality rate amongst the industrialized countries. Our cesarean section rate has gone from 5% in 1970 to 33% without improved outcomes. So, and then women don't have autonomy. They are, most of them feel they're forced into a system. And right now the answer, and we know that women of color are treated worse than white women with higher mortality. And the answer is to get a doula, or at least that's what we're told. So the person, the lowest paid person with the least amount of power in the room is supposed to keep the system from killing you. And women don't have body autonomy to choose the practitioner of their choice. And a lot of women are just going it alone. And you run the risk of somebody calling CPS if you do that.
Any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Deanne.